experience of homicide, death is a way of life. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, which is a town, says a small city, about 750,000 people. This year, Baltimore will have about 350 homicides. Much of my research has been on homicide, much of it has been on homicide in Baltimore. So let's talk a little bit about a murder in America. Example number 1, July 14, 1992, in Baltimore, Maryland, 8 people were shot. But there's nothing unusual about that. We have 8 people shot probably a dozen times a year. Two of them died. 2 homicides in one day, but there was nothing unusual about that. That happens about 50 times a year in Baltimore. What made that day unusual is that both of those people who died for the same reason, the same motive. They stepped on the offender's toes. The American experience of homicide is dying because you stepped on somebody's toes. Other reasons that turned up in my research, he turned up the heat. I didn't want it to, so I shut him. He was talking to my girlfriend. He put his hand on my girlfriend's butt, or he looked at me, so he shut him. Example number 2. The best known gun battle in American history is the gunfight at the OK Corral. It wasn't much of a gunfight, actually. The Herb brothers just pretty well shot some people down, but it's famous. 9 men, and in about 1 minute, 35 rounds were fired, 35 bullets. In 1992, police were called to a shooting in Baltimore, Maryland, where, as the officer said, he found the drug dealer with the 2 guns smoking at his feet. He was dead, he was wearing a bulletproof vest, but had finally been shot through the head. He had been ambushed by 2 men, one of whom had a fully automatic weapon. He had 2 semi-automatic weapons, and in the space of less than 20 seconds, 65 rounds were fired. The experience of homicide in the United States, then, is 65 bullets flying through the air of an American city in the middle of the afternoon. Throughout this, I will stress how social group specific homicide is, and I will try to explain the increase in homicide since 1968, pointing out that it has not been spread evenly across the social groups of America. I want to do 2 things. First, I want to present a picture of what we think we know about homicide in the United States, focusing on the changes since 1968. And then I'm going to focus on the characteristics that will help us to understand the higher homicide rates and to understand the difference in homicides that have occurred since that time. I will focus on firearms and on the culture of violence. First, talking about rates of homicide. Over the past 50 years, from 1940 to 1968, there was a relatively normal homicide rate in the United States. It never went below 6 per 100,000. It never went above, or it never went below 4 per 100,000. Never went above 6 per 100,000. Very stable, very predictable, very much like European rates. But in 1968, those rates started to go up, and the increase has been dramatic, and it has been steep. In 1980, it was 10 per 100,000. For 30 years, the homicide rates in the United States did not change, and then in 10 years, they more than doubled. First, take as a normal base those normal homicides. The husband killing his wife, as I say to my Swiss friends when I do this in Switzerland, the farmer in Appenzell, the Austrian farmer in Tyrol, or as you would say in Maryland, the farmer in Hagerstown, who spends 40 years nagging his wife, and after 40 years finally comes in and she's had it, and he says something to her, she takes the frying pan and brains him. Normal fights. Two friends who go into a bar, get into an argument about who the greatest baseball team in history was, and one of them winds up dead. Normal homicides. They have stable characteristics and have had for years. It's a male activity. About 85% of all of them are male, both as offender and as victim. They are poor, both relative and absolute. They tend to be urban homicides, and they involve friends or family about 70% of the time. That's in the United States and in Austria. But since 1968, there have been changes that have occurred in a superstructure, the kinds of homicides built on top of that. One of the things that has changed most dramatically has been a change in relationships between offenders and victims. There's some problems with coding, but I'm not going to go into that. Let's talk about what really shows up. In cities in the United States, about 50% of all the homicides now involve strangers or enemies, not friends or family. So the base is still there, but these new homicides are building on top of it. That base is where we've always liked kills like. Usually, you always hurt the one you love, you usually kill somebody like you. Same age, same group, same sex, same social class. So we've always been able to use victim data to also tell us about offenders. But the Baltimore data and some data that's from St. Louis, some data that's from Chicago, has both offenders and victims by case, and we've been able to see some problems coming. Among those, I'm 50 years old. I don't look it. See, I can say that to a class, and the class has to agree with me because I'm giving him grades. Five years from now, if I am murdered, it will not be by somebody like me. It will not be by somebody my age or in my social class. Most likely, if I am murdered in Baltimore, it will be by a group of young men, probably minority. So we see an increase in stranger homicides, we see an increase in felony homicides, we see an increase in robbery homicides, and as a result of all of that, all of these are the kinds of homicides that are harder to clear. So we find a decreasing homicide clearance rate. Years ago, I used to be able to say that about 80% of all homicides were cleared. Currently, anything from 40 to 60% of all homicides ever get cleared. Related to the relationships, we see a second change, which is age of the offenders. Now, despite some political claims to the contrary, there wasn't an increase, there was not an increase in juvenile homicides in Baltimore, or apparently in the nation, up to about 1986. The rate of juveniles arrested nationally showed very little change up to about there. But all of that has changed now. Between 1986 and 1994, the rate of juvenile involvement in homicide increased dramatically and statistically significantly. There has been, since 1980, a dramatic increase in the 18 to 25-year-old age group. 30 years ago, all of the things I used to be able to say to classes, I can't say anymore. 30 years ago, for years, the modal age, the most common age, for homicide offenders was 30 to 34. In 1980, that age had dropped to 20 to 24. And in 1991 and 92 and on, by a very small number, but still small enough to make it the number one group, the largest group, the modal group for homicide offenders is 15 to 19, with a concentration in the 18 to 19-year-olds. A third change, also related to the other two, ethnic and racial rates are changing and we're losing ground. From 1950 to 1980, the difference in black and white homicide rates decreased. We closed the gap. In 1950, blacks were 10 times more likely to commit a homicide or be involved in homicide than whites were. By 1970, we had dropped that to 5 times more likely. 1991, it has gone back up to 7 times more likely. And in 1990, for the first time since we've kept records, a majority of victims and offenders, not just a disproportionate number, but an absolute majority of victims and offenders of homicides are African Americans in the United States. So there are changes in factors and changes in types as homicide has increased. It has not increased across the board. So the type as well as the rate has changed since 1986. As a result, the effect of the change, the increase, is not spread evenly across the American population, but it is focused and concentrated in specific social groups, and it is devastating those groups. So what are the key factors in this homicide change? What brought it about, or what can we hopefully use to explain it? Well, let me do 2, and let me start with firearms. My research in Baltimore, Decker and Rosenfield's research in St. Louis, and Watkins Zimmer's research in Chicago all says the same thing. That there was an increase in the 1960s and the 1970s in homicides that was strictly due to firearms use. It is significantly easier to kill somebody with a gun than it is with a knife, a club, or your own hands. Nationally, about 65% of all homicides involve guns, about 50% of all homicides involve handguns. But this is for all age groups across the board. This is not a significant change. So what happened that made a significant change? Well, Baltimore is a good example of the idea of convergence of factors in high-risk groups. Baltimore, 1960 to 1986. The white female offender homicide rate did not change. The black male offender homicide rate increased very slightly. The white male homicide offender homicide rate increased very slightly. But the black female rate decreased significantly. There was a significant decline. In 1986, the black female rate was 1/2 of what it had been in 1974, but no similar change occurred in the black male rate. Why? Because during this period, there was a significant increase in black male firearm use. In 1964, 41% of all the black male offenders used a gun. By 1980, 65% of all the black male offenders used a firearm, which matched the national average. Currently, the rate is about 75%. With this increase in lethality came an increase in homicide rates. If this gun use increase had not occurred, it is very likely that the black male homicide rate would have dropped like the black female rate. It was, in fact, then a convergence of guns and a black male street culture. So why doesn't the United States do something about guns? This has led to the most fascinating conversations with my European friends I have ever had. They do not understand why we don't do something about them. The facts are significant. Wright, Rossi, and others estimate that something between 140 and 200 million guns are in the hands of American citizens. That's better than one per household. What Wright and Rossi called the firearms predator, we would call the real bad guy. Their firearms predator, by age 16, has owned a gun, committed a serious crime, had sex, used alcohol, used drugs, been arrested at least once, and has moved out of home, all of that, before he is of legal age to drive a car. Surveys in the United States show that 15% of high school students aged 14 to 18 carried a gun at some point within the last 30 days. 4 to 6% of them brought a gun to school. In Baltimore, 75% of the homicides are committed with guns. And the numbers are not hard to explain. The numbers are here. It's the meaning that's hard to explain to a European. The example I use is this. A man named Sam Colt built the classic Western pistol, the gun you see in all the cowboy movies, the Colt 45. There was, in fact, a phrase and an expression back then that God made man, but Sam Colt made him equal. And the pistol itself was called the Equalizer. In the hands, then, of a young man with no education, no home life, no job, no skills, no chance, that gun means power, equality, respect, and honor. Learn a new word, taught my European friends a new word. Dist. Disrespected. Dist is a major and acceptable motive in street culture to kill an individual. It means that that individual did not show you the proper respect, and it is accepted, fully accepted, as a reason to kill him. What we have then is a culture, a rhetoric, and a vocabulary of motive, of violence. Let's talk then about that culture of violence. that culture accepts violence as a proper way to react. It provides a vocabulary of violence to use. Since 1968, we have a Vietnam War, a war on drugs, and an end of censorship in 1965 that led to graphic and positive violence in the media. It is estimated that the average U.S. child will see 14,000 homicides in his television viewing career. But this increase in culture is most significant in particular groups. And those groups, again, are men, minority, and urban. The impact on Black America is staggering. A criminologist named C.J. Wiltz says that there is no phenomenon more damaging to Black life in America than homicide. Only Black males, as far as I can find in this century, show a decrease in life expectancy, and that decrease is explainable through homicide. Murder is the leading cause of death for America's Black men between the ages of 18 and 35. You'll see other ages. That's the Centers for Disease Control. This culture of violence is not some theoretical construct. It is a reality on the streets. At present rates, 1 out of every 24 Black males in America can expect to die as a result of a murder. Because there are more offenders than victims, 1 out of every 10 Black men in America can expect to be involved in murder in his life.